Joining us now, former New York Congressman and senior advisor for the Political Action Committee Vote Vets, Max Rose. He served as an Army infantry officer in Afghanistan and received a Bronze Star and Purple Heart for his service. Max, Congressman, I'm happy to have you, but I don't want to talk to you about political leanings here. I want to talk to you about your experience in the Army. When Donald Trump says this sort of stuff, he wants to use the Army. There were certainly concerns about that while he was in office from his security officials, from his military officials. They worried about what he thought he could do. They now say, and I've had conversations with a lot of these folks, that they're worried about who he might install and whether those people might do what the former officials did, which was act as a wall against Donald Trump's more baser instincts. If he were to install people that were more sympathetic to him, would he have the support of the rank and file to do things like have the military go after Americans?
You know, the thing about being in the military that's really special to the United States of America and special to the institution is that you swear an oath not to your leader, in fact, not just to the country, but rather to a document, to a set of principles, to the Constitution. And it is your responsibility to protect the nation against enemies to those principles, both foreign and domestic. You know, Donald Trump has not changed over the last decade, but one of the defining factors of his first presidency were such leaders as Esper, Milley, Kelly, who remembered that oath and bore allegiance to it and stood up to Donald Trump. Now Donald Trump has said that he will not appoint people who will have courage and who will have discipline. But I actually still retain great confidence in the men and women of the United States military, that they'll remember their oath to the Constitution and that they actually have an obligation to reject orders from whether it's the President of the United States or their superiors. But man, the stakes of this election could not be higher when you have a leading candidate saying that he will, for all intents and purposes, attempt to wage war on his fellow citizens. It's as scary as it gets.
So where does your worry lie, you know, on a scale from 1 to 10, as somebody who's had the experience of being in the military and somebody who's had the experience of being in Congress and somebody who, you know, has seen Donald Trump, watched him for the past 9 years? Where, you know, if you're going to rank your worry, where is it on a scale?
I mean, it couldn't be higher. It couldn't be higher. Donald Trump is a threat to all that we hold dear. But I don't want you to confuse that intense worry with any absence of confidence in our men and women in uniform, who, by the way, right now, and for literally every day of my entire lifetime, have been putting their lives in harm's way in defense of all that we hold dear. It is such a shame, though, that part of that sacrifice, part of that fight may very well be standing up to a leader here at home. It is, again, why this election is so significant, because Donald Trump, it wasn't like he didn't try last time around, and at times even potentially successful. Look at what he did with the Muslim ban, for instance. Look at what he did at Lafayette Square, where literally virtually gassed on citizens, our fellow citizens. He, time and again, tried to push the limits in a truly fascist manner of what the presidency is meant to be. And so many times it was the brave, silent acts of individuals, generals as well below, to prevented him from doing that. This time around, one thing we have to give him and his colleagues, they will be less incompetent at trying to exercise their power. And that's why it makes the stakes of this election even higher.
I know there.
What is it? Just 20 or so days left to stand up to truly what is a living fascist.
You know, there have been former military officials, security officials who have come out on the record. They've voiced their support either individually or their worry about Donald Trump either individually or together in the form of a letter. They've spoken to reporters. I've had really detailed conversations with a lot of these high-level folks about their concerns, saying that they don't believe Donald Trump has any guardrails. They don't believe that Donald Trump believes in the Constitution. There's not a moral center there that would keep him from trying to use the military if he could. There are voters, though, who hear him say that, and they don't really take it seriously. They don't think he would follow through on that. They think that people who say that they're worried about Donald Trump are just being, alarmist, or they're just partisan. Sure. You come from Staten Island. Why don't voters believe it when Donald Trump says these things?
Well, certainly I think that people acknowledge that he is a threat to many of the pillars that we hold dear. It's one of the reasons why I bring up things like Lafayette Square, and I bring up things like the Muslim ban, which with time and all the issues and craziness of modern day politics, we can so easily forget. But I do think there is an issue that people are not focusing on, which is, generals and military leaders are by their very nature apolitical. They spent their entire professional lives in an institution that said, irrespective of the political affiliation of their leader, you answer to the commander-in-chief. It takes a threat as grave as Donald Trump and his movement for these individuals to actually stand up and express what is a political belief, that Donald Trump is not suited to be president of the United States, not suited to be anywhere near the Oval Office. They don't take that decision lightly or easily. It is almost against military culture. But every single leader with significant responsibility who has come anywhere near Donald Trump, whether the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and on downwards, has said that this individual, Donald Trump, is extraordinarily dangerous, that you cannot take these words lightly. And I think we should not just take Donald Trump's words seriously, but also their warnings.
And when I say voters, I mean some voters, not all voters. Max Rose, congressman from Staten Island, former. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.